I would like to thank all the organizers for invitation. I feel very both privileged and honored to be here. I believe this is a very important conference. I would like to extend my special thanks to Mrs. Nora Vurkimovic, who literally dragged me here and helped me with every step, so to say. I would like also express my apologies. I have my paper, which has some 10.5 pages, which is more or less 20 minutes. But my apology consists of the fact that I won't be reading it. Because since I read even worse than I speak. When I read, it's the kind of disaster, you won't get anything. So I would like to prefer to speak, just having some notes on my paper, and to that effect, I will try to help myself and you with this presentation. Don't worry, even so this picture looks very bombastic, my paper is kind of more academic style. In my presentation, I would like to talk about Ukrainian dimension of the war. Actually, Ukrainian historians, they get used to that. In each conference, we put at the very end of the line of discussions, mostly because I believe it's because in Cyrillic and Latin, letter U is at the end of the alphabet. Still, I don't mind, and I believe in these circumstances, it even kind of advantageous, since it'll help me to develop some of my points, because those points has been one way or another has been already expressed by the previous presentators, and I will especially would like to highlight the presentation of Professor Balogh, which I'm very impressed. I would sign under each of his sentences, and my presentation will be like a minor footnote to what he already said. So I would like to start with quotation of Czesław Miłosz. The name, I believe, doesn't require introduction, the famous Nobel Prizer, Polish poet, who was at that time teaching in California in '69. A year after the Prague Revolution, after the student revolution in Paris, he was writing a letter to his close friend, Jerzy Giedroyc, who was an eminent Polish intellectual immigration, editor of the probably most important Polish migrant journal Kultura. And he wrote to the fact that politically, this is '69, we are facing the growth of nationalism of the Nazis type. It takes place in Russia, it also takes place in Ukraine and other republics. It's the same in Poland. If that outburst occurs, it will be completely blind, with people slaughtering each other, and the problems of Lviv, the Treaty of Riga, etc., will be revived. And this time we are prepared to ultimately perish under the heaviness of that cataclysm. What is interesting about this quotation, for sure he exaggerates, but still I believe his fears to some extent were actually substantiated. But what is interesting in this case, he refers specifically to a case of Polish-Ukrainian war, which started 10 days before the final agreement, which ended the war. It started on the November 1st, and the main focus of the conflict was Lviv. Actually, it was probably the most senseless conflict in this part of the world, because strategically, national interest of Poles and Ukrainians lay somewhere else, to the west and to the east. But still, Lviv or Lemberg occupied that important part in their symbolical imagination that they couldn't imagine their national state without Lviv, and therefore they started a war that lasted for the next 9 months since the end of the First World War. And actually, this brings me to give some kind of irony, since the war per se, in historical studies and historical memory, practically doesn't exist. What does exist is this final moment of national struggle, which mostly were after the war, not during the war. Partly it could be explained by the fact that actually the war in the Eastern Front, and more specifically on Ukrainian ethnic territory, was rather an eventful war. There was not a big events there, like it was in the West Front. No Ypres, no Marna, no other battles. it happened very promising by the attack of the Russian army at the first weeks of the war, and the capturing the Lviv, the city, the capital of Galicia, and the whole large province. It held this control until the spring of 1917. There has been expelled, 15. There has been expelled by the joint offensive of Germans and Austrian forces. And then in summer 16, during the famous Brusilov offensive, and then again in summer 17, already after the Russian Revolution, Russian army tried to repeat its success, but it never did. And as a result, the front line has been rather stabilized, and this is the front line of the Eastern Front. And more or less, it didn't penetrate far into the former Austrian Eastern territory. More or less, it corresponded to the pre-war border. So actually, there is no big event there. And as a matter of fact, the biggest event, or really the event, started after the war. This is the map of the Ukraine several months, actually year after the war. And what you see here, it's a kind of immense conflict, or many conflicts, which is led by the two Russians army. This is Red Army and White Army. There is separate armies of two separate Ukrainian republics. Ukraine National Republic, Ukraine Western National Republic, Russian and the Austrian part. There is a Polish army, Romanian army, and most importantly, the French occupational forces on the south, which replaced before that German occupational forces. And then again, which is very interestingly, you have a large area which is virtually controlled by the peasant large army of Makhno, which is believed to be probably one of the most successful peasant army ever been acting in the world history in the 20th century. So what I mean to say here, you have actually kind of a very complicated picture, which is very hard to put in a unilingual story. Partly it's because Ukraine has been set as a borderland, and we know the borderlands history always runs differently, much complicated. Just to give you the example, this is the map from the very good book written by Russian historian Hornarsky on Ural, but there's a very nice map which shows the frequency of shift of powers since the Russian Revolution in different parts of the Russian gubernia. And as you see, at the Russian core, ethnic territory, the number of the shifts were 2 to 4. Why in the periphery, specifically in Ukraine, there was 8 and 9, 8 and more. Say Ukraine, Kyiv, which has become a capital of Ukraine in 1917, has witnessed 11 turnovers, and Lviv and Western Ukraine experienced same powers. Most interestingly, kind of the how should I put it, attraction. There was a distant level station in this industrial region of the Donbass where power changed hands 27 times during the half of the year only. And this gives you an idea about the specific of the local Ukrainian situation. In a way, it was the Hobbesian war of everyone against everyone. Actually, to a certain reflex, it continues the story of the 19th century, because in the 19th century, Ukrainian territory was a territory of the rival nationalism, and you can hardly find any kind of the segment of Ukrainian territory which would not be simultaneously claimed at least by two rival nationalism. Actually, this is a nightmare of nationalism, which has been implemented during the First World War to the full. But, excuse me, this doesn't work. Unfortunately, I will tell you, probably to tell my own words. So what is the problem? What's the problem? How to conceptualize this? How to bring to someone of the story? I say that one of the main challenges is that we have not one conflict, but several conflicts, as it used to be in the borderlands. First of all, there is a world war per se. And Ukrainian ethnic territory is one of the major theaters of this war. Secondly, there is, after the Russian Revolution, 1917, Ukraine turned into one of the most important part of the territory of the Russian Civil War between the Russian Reds and Russian Whites. And in some period, especially 1918, this was the most crucial, decisive territory when this conflict has been resolved. Then there is a national movement, including the Ukrainian national movement, which tried to install their national states on this territory, which are, so say, in confrontation with other armies. Then there is even a civil war within each national movement. Like in Ukrainian case, you have Ukrainian rights and Ukrainian left, which also fighting with each other. And last but not least, you have a huge peasant uprising, which has some moments of the civil war and national movement, but could not be reduced to this because it has low logic of its own. So actually, we have 5 conflicts. And what does historiography done so far? For sure, Soviet historiography would concentrate on the Russian Revolution 1917, so-called Great October. In a logical way, we say that all the events which has been taking place in Ukraine, it's about the revolution, this revolution. Actually, ironically, this has been also expressed by some Western historians. We say that basically, if you look on the history of Russian Empire in 1917, it could be boiled down to a very simple fact. It's a conflict between Russian Reds and Russian Whites, period. Which is not the case here, for sure. While Ukrainian national historiography will focus on national movement, even so it's failed. It provided with some share of the national heroes and battles and events, which fits in the national pantheon and so on and so forth. But still, this is very limited perspective. So I believe the main challenge is to incorporate all the 5 conflicts to make one story or master narrative. And what I'm trying to do in the time which is left, to say that actually the most, to my understanding, the most promising aspect is if we try to integrate 2 different stories. First of all, World War per se, which is topic of our conference, and second, peasant movement. And this combination provides two very interesting results about the history, about the character of the First World War. So this is wrong. Okay. So first of all, or not first of all, I'm continuing. It's not the first. It's probably 10th of all. For sure, Ukrainian national movement was not the main player. It was rather marginal, probably of the second or even the third range. If this would be no war, probably it wouldn't play any significant role. This was the war that intensified the national issue. It initialized it, it created some kind of tense field when national issue becomes and more, especially the end of the war, much more and more important. Specifically, Ukrainian issue, there has been no Ukrainian state, ethnicity, whatever, which has been treated seriously by any of the rival states before the First World War. Even Ukrainians referred to themselves as Ukrainians. Those who are living in the Habsburg called themselves Ruthenians. Those who live in Russians called themselves Little Russians, and there is no concept of Ukrainians. So in Ukraine, the concept emerged only by the end of the war. But there is some kind of potential in that, because first of all, this is the character of the war itself. We know that this is not just the First World War was not just another war, it was a total war, and therefore it depended very much, result of the war depended on the control of the natural resources, which were the key for the success. And Ukraine has two important natural resources. The Russian part has grain. Ukraine used to be kind of traditional granary, and before the war, 1913, it has produced 16 million tons of grain. And these numbers, they act as a magnet for each rivaling side, specifically at the end of the war, when the hunger strike was facing the capitals in Petrograd, in Berlin, and Vienna, and then with the revolution. And we know that in Petrograd, everything started with the hunger strike. While the Austrian part has another strategic sources, and this was oil. We may know, this is kind of the fact which has been relieved recently, that actually by the end of the war, the Austrian German fleet was waging the war on the Galician oil, and very much depended on the supply from Galicia, and also became a negotiating item during the Paris treaty between the Polish government and France and Britain, and to a large extent, it sealed the fate of this territory for the next 20 minutes. Not less important for human resources. Ukrainians was the second largest group in the Russian Empire and the fifth largest group in the Austrian Empire. Since we know that this is war of attrition, and human resources cannon fodder was very much important. So our control of the Ukrainian territory, of these huge resources, was also very crucial to the result of the war. And most of all, there was also some kind of strategical concerns, which brings the Ukrainian issue to the fore. First of all, there has been some calculations that raised by the German experts that control over Ukraine is the key to decline of the Russian Empire. As the Paul Rohrbach put it, whoever controls Kyiv holds the key to Russia. Vice versa, Russian authorities claim that they waged the war to liberate the Slavs from the German yoke, but out of the Slavs territory and the Germans and the Austrians, they outlined Galicia, Transcarpathia, and Bukovina, which is nowadays Ukrainian territory, which in the eyes of the Petersburg or Petrograd were the eternal Russian lands. So therefore, this explains why they were so persistent in attacking this territory throughout the first 3 years of the war. But also very important, they see Galicia, largest crown land of the Austrian Empire, as a net of the Polish nationalism, which was anti-Russian by definition, and also Ukrainian separation. So therefore, they choose this region for the attack, as some historians believe, especially Klaus Bachmann, that in this specific conjecture of the Eastern Front, the issue of Galicia was a major casus belli of the war between Austria and Petersburg, second probably to Balkans only. It's not to give you an idea again that Ukrainian nationalism was an important player. As I say, they were marginal. As a matter of fact, they were following the line and they were treating very cautiously, so to say. At the very beginning, they proclaimed loyalty to each of their empire, and I believe they were sincere. Only by the end of the war, when they were somewhat frustrated by Vienna, respectively, and Petrograd, they decided to a more neutral state, but then again, they never reviewed any kind of demands for Ukrainian political independence. The idea was transformation of empires in the federative state in which Ukraine would be a separate unit, not a state, but an administrative cultural unit. Only with the German occupation in January 1919, they were forced to proclaim this independence, complete independence from the Russia. I would say that probably, as I say, the behavior would just become a small, minor footnote in the history of Ukrainian during the First World War, if not the great transformation which occurred with the local peasants, which made a backbone. Approximately 90% of the potential Ukrainian nation was imagined by the Ukrainian patriots. We were talking yesterday about the Golden Age, about the Silver Age, Hungarian-Russian case. Something like that was also the case with the Ukrainian peasant society. Because at the end of the 19th century, Ukrainians, whatever they call themselves, enter into a so-called transformation, demographic transition from the high level of reproduction, high mortality, high birth, to the low level of mortality, which gives a way to an explosion, demographic explosion of Ukrainians. For the last 50 years of the 19th Empire, the number doubled. But the size of the lands remained the same, which provoked a huge land hunger, and which expelled many Ukrainians, specifically younger ones, to look for work, either in the cities or to go in migration to North America or South America. In a way, this was the first way of the globalization, which many of these Ukrainians followed. There is some story, probably apocryphically, that those Ukrainian peasants who were fighting the war, in some of the cases, they knew a name of the street in Chicago better than streets in Przemysl, another city of this region. Or there is another apocryphal story that in one unit, Austrian unit, the working language, lingua franca, was English, because this is the only language with which Austrian officers could communicate with the Ruthenian peasants which returned from United States. There are also some another very important innovations, like it has been testified by some studies, like emergence of the book reading clubs, emergence of the bookshelves in the houses, including for sure books, and so on and so forth. But probably most importantly is that at the end of the 19th century, before the war, peasants started to send their kids to gymnasia, sometimes to the university, and therefore by the 1914-1917, you have an emergence of the whole generation of young intellectuals, free professions, probably low status, but still of the peasant origin, so-called generation of 1917. This has been kind of the also a war. How much time do I have? Excuse me. How? 4 minutes, okay. So I'll do my best. So also 4 minutes, thank you. So also what was very important here, that war was the most massive intrusion of modernity in the peasant world. First of all, it imposed peasants to the modern war technology, which was the most modern by definition. Secondly, the army taught them organization and discipline, those two principles of the modern world, whose efficiency peasants could witness with their own eyes during combat. And thirdly, they exposed them to political propaganda, to the new ideas, ideologies, nationalism, socialism, communism, like that, which, in a way, albeit in very simplified, exposed them to the modern ideologies. As a result, what you have there, you have a very mobilized society which may provide, those who survive, may provide already leaders for the peasant movement. Since I don't have time, I have to skip some of the parts, but this part will be important. At one specific moment, during the war, but after the Russian Revolution, February Revolution, before the October Revolution, there has been elections to Constituent Assembly. The only democratic elections that has been in Ukraine, that has been in the Russian Empire until the end of the Soviet Union. The results was very important, the difference between Russia and Ukraine and Russia. Ukrainian peasants gave their support not to Russian socialist parties, but to Ukrainian socialist parties, for a variety of reasons which I wouldn't discuss here, but this is also a very important point which has long-lasting effect. In you know this kind of famous discussion between Rosa Luxemburg and Lenin. Rosa Luxemburg, among others, was accusing Lenin about indulging Ukrainian nationalism. And Lenin responded that, look at the results of the Constituent Assembly. 5 million votes that the Ukrainian parties got then were sufficient proof that the Ukrainian movement was not be that likely. This is how this peasant leaders look like, including Makhno in the center, very picturesque, so to say. But what is the important here? Bolsheviks could relatively easily do with all the modern parties, rivals, armies, like a white army, German army, or French army, whatever, or the armies of Ukrainian national movement. For them, it was hard to deal with the Ukrainian peasants. You could expel them. You couldn't terrorize them to the extent as they did because they expand on the grain. And peasants was very resistant to Bolsheviks, actually to every regime. It took Soviets 3 efforts to come to control Ukraine, and each time they has been expelled by the peasant rebellions. And I would claim that this led a very traumatic experience of the leaders of the Soviet Union, including Stalin. He remembered that well, this kind of particular pattern of Ukraine, so to say, this kind of resistance potential of the Polish Ukrainian peasants, and has been a dramatic or tragic impact during the collectivization, because during the first mass collectivization, the pattern has been repeated. Ukrainian peasants were on the fore of the resistance to the Soviet collectivization, and once Stalin seen this was official statistic made by NKVD, Stalin had the impression that this is repetition, reiteration of the old story. Something has to be done with this. And therefore, he chose to organize, so say, additional blow, this artificial famine, to appease Ukraine, and so forth. I will finish probably with this statistic, which I believe is very telling, and it tells a lot. This is a statistic of the life expectancy in Ukraine throughout 20th century among the males and females. The blue line is for Ukrainians, the red line is for Europeans. As you see that most of the cases, it could be expectable, the Ukrainian life expectancy is lower than European. No surprise here. But what is very important here, if you look at the life expectancy during the First World War, you will see that demographically, it was not that big disaster as we may presume. Even the civil war, the 2 years were the most, really catastrophic. The one is 42, which makes no surprise because this is the year of the Holocaust, the military operations, and many, casualties which were caused by the war. But the most important thing is the 1933, which has the lowest life expectancy, which brings me to a kind of a conclusion, or primary conclusion, that has been already made by some Russian historians doing Soviet story, that even in relatively peaceful time, the citizens of Soviet Union, including Ukraine, suffered much more heavily than citizens of the Western Europe in war time. So I would conclude with the story that actually there is a whole right to talk not about First World War separately, but talk about the 30 years, 20th century 30 years war, which started 1914 and 1945, which globally transformed this situation. Most of Ukrainians would say, and this will be kind of the reiterating metaphor, that Ukraine has been born into flame of the war and revolution. They use this metaphor, sometimes they abuse it, and I believe it still makes sense. But it makes sense if we replace the emphasis from the war to Ukraine to the world modern. Because basically, this war is about modernity. Modernity, as I presume, homogeneous society, urban society, whatever we mean by that, because what the war did, it just erased peasantry, and also, by definition, expansion, the world of the Eastern Jews, the Yiddish cultural world of the shtetl, and therefore created quite different society. So what I'm claiming, my claim is here, that when talking about the First World War more, especially in the Ukrainian context, what Ukrainian dimensions try to tell us, it's about modernity, but modernity perceived in the very special terms. And not just about the nice things about schools, universities, railroad things, it's about the violence. That violence has been a central part, essential part, not a marginal part of the modernity, at least this kind of the world. This is not actually a new conclusion. This conclusion has been reached by the Zygmunt Bauman when he wrote about the Holocaust. Because actually, yes, he said about the Holocaust, we have to expect that Holocaust and modernity, they essentially link with each other. Because Holocaust is within the modernity. It's an essential part of modernity, not a kind of the exception or marginal event. So what I'm telling him, bringing Ukrainian dimension into the picture, help us to reassess modernity per se. I like this project very much of rethinking, not just national history, but rethinking modernity per se. The process that has been initiated by the Leszek Kolakowski, one of my favorite authors in this famous book, Modernity to Endless Trial. We have to put modernity to endless trial, so to say. We have to rethink it, but in postmodern way, but not necessarily with postmodern gibberish. And Kolakowski is also a favorite author of the Tony Judd, the other historian who I admire, which wrote a perfect book on post-war. I believe most of us know of these books. What I like especially about this book, the Judd says to what extent this was important in building new Europe, the concept of the dealing with the memory or overcoming the memory, historical memory, so to say, to replace the conflicts with reconciliation, which was the part of the whole construction of Europe. It has a specifically good conclusion chapter about the Holocaust. So I'm adding to the conclusion. I believe what really happened, most important thing happened recently in Ukraine, this has been Polish-Ukrainian reconciliation, especially around Lviv And you see the picture for this reconciliation, which has been shaded by one of the leading intellectuals and supported by two churches. And this worked. It worked perfectly. And from the geopolitical point of view, it looks like a real revolution, because you now have a very kind of normal relations between Ukrainian and Poles. And I would say this Polish-Ukrainian relation could be put on a par with the French-German reconciliation in the 50s. To the extent French-German reconciliation built a constructive bloc for the new Europe, to the same extent, Polish-Ukrainian reconciliation opened a possibility to extend the spirit further east. For sure, the most important element of this construction will be Polish-Russian and Ukrainian-Russian reconciliation. But so far, it seems not hardly possible, because as Poles say, it takes two to tango. And Kremlin doesn't seem to be willing nowadays to accept the logic of reconciliation, because for them, reconciliation is a sign, compromise is a sign of the weakness, not of the strength. So my idea, and as concluding remark, is that before, if ever, we reach conclusion with any kind of reconciliation with Russia, we had to do it in Ukrainian reconciliation, so to say. And I believe only with this Ukrainian reconciliation we could close the chapter which has been opened 100 years ago in 1914. Thank you so much.